maybe we can talk a little bit about some of your writing process. So, how did you go about this? So, I saw you have a novella that's kind of a prequel to this. I'm assuming a prequel. And then,
Yeah.
how did you outline a lot? Do you like to just kind of write it, see where it goes? Like, what's your kind of process for creating?
Yeah, that's a really it's a really good question because so with the novella, I didn't actually know I was going to write that novella. Um, I finished writing An Exile of Water and Gold and sent it off to beta readers, and I had about a month, I guess, to kind of not write anything and take a break. But my creative obsessive mind couldn't let go. So I essentially ended up writing the novella, and it was, I guess, it was a bit of an investigative story for me, for a few reasons. So one, the novella's main character, in many ways, like represents, I think, myself and the way that I think about the world. So it kind of became quite a personal project. But then at the same time as that, um, I played a lot with my writing process for that novella, and it seemed to work in my favor. I think because it's a shorter text type,
Hmm.
but it's very locked down to one character's point of view. There's no other point of view in the story. The thing about the novella is that it's written in alternating timelines. So essentially, there's there's two kind of timelines that are 50 years apart, focusing on the same character, and they kind of come to a head in terms of the climax of the story. Each timeline has its own climax that somehow interfere with each other at the end of the book.
Hmm.
Um, and it was a lot of discovery, right? Which, like, I like to outline. I kind of see myself as a bit of a mix of like a pantser and a plotter, in the sense that I like to know where I'm going. I'll tend to still have a chapter by chapter scaffold as well, but it's not super in depth, so I'll
Hmm.
leave things open for me to kind of figure out as I go. But the novella for me was actually a way to try to figure out some of the history and the lore of my world. And what that's done is it's actually now helped feed back into Exile in the editing process. Like, I've been able to take that knowledge and like kind of reapply it. Um, so yeah, it's a bit of an interesting one. Like, Exile was written completely differently. That was like chapter by chapter, super rigorously following the outline, trying to make sure that I hit the story beats, um, trying not to blow out past kind of 150,000 words and trying not to go too far under that because I wanted it to be an epic fantasy. So, whereas the novella was really just, let's just play around for a few weeks. And I ended up writing that in 2 weeks. It just kind of vomited out of me.
Hmm.
The other thing with the novella, it was actually already in a pretty good place at the end. Weirdly enough, like, usually I find I have to do significant rewrites at the end of a draft, to kind of pull everything together and tie off the threads. But with the novella, I actually sent it off to some beta readers and an editor, and they were all like, "Yeah, well, this is pretty much good to go."
Hmm.
So that was cool to see as well. And I'm not sure whether that, again, is just because it's shorter, so there's less room for error, or whether it's because my process was completely different, and it was more of a personal writing experience for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there always has to be like I've started out. I'm definitely more of an outliner. I like to know where I'm going. I like to plan things. I like to world build. No, like it's hard for me to just kind of like if I don't know how the magic system works, it's hard to like just go with it for me.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there definitely has to, I still think, be a moment of discovery writing. Like even if you're a big outliner, like I've always like I'll start writing and then as I write, I'm like, oh, this is maybe makes more sense for the magic system to work or this culture to work or whatever it is. Um, so it does seem like there always has to be that little discovery writing time, but I like knowing where I'm going for sure.
Yeah,
you know, yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I think for me, it's like I like to know where I'm going roughly, but I still want to be able to play in that sandbox a little bit. You know what I mean? It's like you've got a sandbox. It's like that thing, like, the video game analogy. Like, I don't write like Skyrim. I don't write like there's endless kind of things that can unfold in front of me. I
Yeah.
write more like a sandboxed, more of a linear kind of story. But there's still room for me to play around within those confines.
Hmm.
Interestingly, like I find a lot of writers um, think differently about this, but knowing the ending is one thing that I haven't really needed to know.
Mm.
So oftentimes my ending will change once I've written it through once. Like I'll write it through once and then I'll be like, actually, I should probably like end it on a completely different note, and I'll go back and redo that. And I haven't heard of that happening often with
Yeah.
people. Um, so that's something that I've noticed about my own process, which is I think a little bit different. Um, but yeah, other than that, yeah, chapter by chapter structure for me just works. Like, and it just like I think it also just it inspires confidence in me that I can actually get the job done. Do you know
Hmm.
what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
there's a bit of that like that trepidation of like, oh my goodness, I've got 150,000 words right in front of
Yeah.
me. How am I going to do this? And breaking it down into that structure firstly lends itself into a way to go forward.
Yeah. I've even went so far sometimes as I don't do this for everything, but it kind of depends on like if I'm struggling to work out a scene or something or a chapter. I don't know if you've seen Abby Emmons' YouTube channel at all. Probably
Oh
you
yeah,
have. She talks about breaking scenes up into like five different parts. So it's like setting or setup, tension, uh shoot, I'm gonna forget what it is. There's like a couple of different
yeah. She kind of follows
segments.
the story mountain for like each individual scene, so that
Yeah.
at the end you've actually got that kind of rising and falling tension for the story as a whole.
Yeah, and I found that really helpful. Like I said, I don't do that for every scene in chapter, depending on how much I feel like I know about what's going to happen. But sometimes if it's a really difficult one, and I'm like, I don't know quite how I'm making this matter, that's been
Yeah,
really helpful to like, I'm just going to write the setup of this. Let's just write the setup, and then write the tension, write each part, and then go back and kind of make sure that they flow correctly, if that makes sense.
yeah. I think you actually make a really good point there. Like if you look at a chapter is kind of it's kind of a self-contained story, right? Like it
Yeah.
needs to have not only a beginning, middle, and end, but it needs to have a conflict in and of itself that is resolved or left hanging at the end to
Hmm.
carry the reader forward to the next scene. So I think if you break it down like that, it's a really good way to kind of apply a little bit of formula to the story process without turning it into a beat by beat kind of thing. Like
Hmm.
there's something to be said for the way that, screenwriters write television episodes where they follow that kind of save the cat beat by beat writing process
Hmm.
because it works. But at the same time, I kind of resist that a little bit just because I feel like it's a way to suppress the art making process if you stick too closely to that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so you kind of have to find that balance, and every writer kind of does it their own way.
Hmm. I like to start with it helps my creativity a little to like start with a structure. So like 3x story structure, whatever, be like, I'm just going to kind of use this as a beginning framework. But then
Yeah,
as it goes, it just kind of like, because I think it helps. What it helps me do is make sure that I got that stuff in there. So like make sure I'm hitting the plot points that actually make the story effective. And then
yeah,
eventually I can rearrange it or do whatever. But it's like a checklist of like, make sure that you have this climactic moment in there, you know?
yeah, sure, yeah. And I think that's another really good point because not only does it mean that you get to tick those boxes, but you can also go back through it in your revisions and look at it and go, like, have I actually nailed the brief? Like, have I actually thought about the themes that I wanted to inject when I set out to write this?
Hmm.
Are they there? Like, is the subtext right? Because I think arguably sometimes we forget about the importance of those supporting details of the subtext or even the context. I guess if you're writing historical fiction, for example, but like all of this stuff has its place. It's not just the active plot that matters.
Hmm.
Um, Even though readers might not necessarily be looking for said theme or said subtext, a lot of the time they're subconsciously taking that in while they're going on the journey. So like we need to be equally as aware of that in the process as well.
Hmm. Yeah. And even like, I find that I have to go back and like work on my outline when I start. This happens occasionally where it's like you're writing a scene and all of a sudden you're like, I don't even know what I'm writing here. Like, what are we going? What are we
Yeah,
doing? Like, what's the purpose of any of what? I just wrote 4,000 words and it's like, none of this matters at all, you know? And that's where I find it helpful to have that, like, that checklist of like, does this have enough tension? Does this have a decision? Does it have, you know, all those elements?